Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm still drinking my morning coffee, and I thought I would do a second informative video for you guys. And today I want to touch a little bit upon the topic of progressive overload versus training volume for your gains. And gains can, again, a term that could mean muscle mass gains, it could mean strength gains, whatever you want to define your gains as, because they're all interrelated and connected anyways. So the whole topic comes up because, we talk about progressive overload, and it's generally understood that progressive overload is the driver of adaptation. And then it throws people off when people hear someone like, say, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld or Dr. Mike Israetel come in and say training volume is the primary driver of adaptation as far as the amount of adaptation that you see. And it confuses people because they don't understand that the terms are not mutually exclusive and that there's an enormous amount of overlap there. And I'm going to explain what I mean in a minute. Now, progressive overload has been accepted for about 2,500 years in Western society for athletes. And this kind of goes back to the story of Milo of Croton. And for those who don't know the story, if you're maybe new to the lifting world, Milo was a wrestler in ancient Greece, purported to be the strongest man in the world at the time. And what he did, he postulated that if he could pick up a baby calf that was a male, that by the time it was a grown bull, if he picked it up every day, that as long as he could gain strength at the rate that it gained body weight as it grew up. And that if he could do that, that by the time it was grown, he would be able to pick up and carry a fully grown bull. And so as the story goes, that's what he did. He got under the bull and squatted it up on his shoulders as a calf and walked around with it and stuff. And he did this every day. And by the time it was a fully grown bull in a couple of years, he was able to get under that bull, get it up on his shoulders, and pick it up, right? Now, a lot of people say, well, I don't know if I believe that, because they're seeing our bulls today that we've selectively bred and we give better feed and everything, and they're seeing these 2,000-pound bulls. People need to understand more realistically a grown bull in that era, in that region of the world, based upon archaeology that we have, probably about a 450-pound bull. So he was the equivalent of could squat about 450 pounds up on his shoulders. Of a bit of an awkward load, which is, pretty strong. If you go to an era where people weren't lifting weights, to be able to pick up 450 pounds on your shoulders, to get under a 450-pound bull and pick it up and squat it up and walk with it, would be a pretty impressive feat of strength, right? It might not be among our Olympic athletes today or our top-level powerlifters and strongmen, but you go back to, when there's no PEDs or anything, and there isn't really controlled resistance training protocols yet, that actually is pretty impressive. So he was able to do that. So that's where the whole concept started, and we've studied it since, and we know that's the case. But then people say, well, what about the training volume thing? Well, let me ask you a question. If you come in and you do the exact same sets and reps for a high volume workout, do you think you're going to continue to make gains off of that if you don't change anything? In other words, if you come in and you do 10 sets of 10 reps on your bench press with 200 pounds and 10 sets of 10 on barbell curls with a 65-pound barbell, and you continue to do that for 6 months, do you think you're going to keep gaining muscle? Of course you aren't. Of course you aren't. Because your training volume and progressive overload stayed the same. In other words, high volume training like that has the potential to put a lot of muscle on you, but there needs to be an accumulation of work. You're going to have to increase something to progress. Progressive overload can be progressive volume. It can be progressive tension, right? Volume meaning sets, reps. Tension meaning the amount of weight on the bar if you're using the exact same form, right? If the range of motion and the angle stay the same, adding more weight creates more tension. If you change form to cheat the weight up or to move it a shorter distance, tension might be reduced. Or it might not increase, but you guys understand the idea. If all other factors are equal, if you either increase weight or you increase the reps or the sets, you've increased volume. But here's the point. You're not going to be able to just continually increase volume forever, because before long you're going to be doing 20 sets of 10 or 20 sets of 20 with the 200 pounds. Eventually it's just going to become unrealistic and silly. You're not going to make gains effectively doing that. So you've got to change things. You have to increase the work either through tension or the accumulation of fatigue over time. So even with a volume component, you need progression. Even when we've seen studies looking at really, really light weights for really high reps producing muscle growth, they're not going to do that for 12 weeks straight. In other words, you can't come in and curl the same 10-pound dumbbells for 200 reps in a session and just keep making progress doing that. You're going to have to progress in some way. You're going to have to add something. And usually it takes about 3 full training sessions before you adapt to something like that, in which case you're going to have to start adding more. And in fact, each subsequent training session with the exact same load gets a more reduced training response. And it's not to say you can't keep making progress to a certain extent, because eventually you'll grow and be able to do more. And that's the point, is that as you adapt, your ability to do more should increase over time. And sometimes it can take a really long time for an advanced lifter, but that's okay. And conversely, let's go over to the guys who, let's look at just purely tension. Let's look at purely progressive overload. Let's say that you can squat 500 pounds in a training session, right, for a single rep. If that's all you're doing is doing 500-pound squats, and you come in and you take one person who squats 500 pounds one time in a week, builds up to a heavy single, does it one time. He's going to have to ramp up to it, so he's got multiple reps in there, versus a guy who finds a way to come in and do 8, 9, or 10 500-pound deadlifts over the course of a week, assuming he recovers, because we have to deal with the stress recovery adaptation cycle. Over the course of 3 months, which one's going to gain more strength? Guy who squats 500 once a week, a guy who squats 500 8 times a week. Which one is going to be stronger, most likely, if you test their max at the end of the 12 weeks? Probably the guy who's doing it more often. Using the same load for only a single rep, but the other one is doing it more frequently with more total weekly volume of doing it. He's repeating it quite a few times throughout the week versus a guy who's only doing it one time through the week. He's going to get a larger training response. And what people need to understand, you can work really hard, but you also need to be able to disrupt your body's homeostasis in some way. And that is done either through additional tension, additional fatigue created through volume, things like that. But by repeatedly doing the same thing, you're getting more volume with the same amount of tension there, and therefore you're going to see more progress. So it's not like these two things are detached. They work hand in hand. And a lot of this is how we've come up with different methods over the years. This is how different forms of periodization were developed in order to actually add these different things progressively so that you can continue to have progressive overload. In other words, even people who do higher volume training, they usually undulate their volume. In other words, they will undulate and find ways to increase the weight, so they'll increase volume over time, reach their maximum recoverable volume, back down a little bit, maybe add a little bit more tension, more weight for a new training response, then increase the volume. So even people who are doing really high volumes of training, they're going to get a seesaw effect in their volume. They're not using the volume exclusively, just continually adding volume. There is an undulating effect in the volume and the tension and the intensity that they are using in order to continue to make progress, because you can't always just keep adding. They have to back off and adjust other variables. And this is usually how most successful lifters lift, who don't just add more drugs. Just up the dose, bro, is the way around this. If you don't understand how to do this, this is usually what you see like in the bodybuilding world. Guys who don't understand how to undulate these things or periodize them or do anything else, they just up the dose. And that works, but that's not going to be the best option for most people who lift. And if you're completely drug-free, it's not an option at all. So understanding how to stagger these things and how to work them is actually a big part of training programming. But people need to lose this idea in their head that progressive overload and volume are two totally separate things. They're both absolutely critical for maximizing your gains. They're both critical, and you can't remove one or the other. In other words, you can't just focus on one or the other. You actually have to be able to manipulate both, because they work hand in hand. And it's as simple as that, guys. It really is. So that it isn't an either or thing. It's not an either or thing. They work in conjunction together. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.